You're listening to Outlook. I'm Anita Anand. Our next guest, 29-year-old Dave Jonsson, originally from Iceland, is a pastor and a father of three in Coquitlam in Canada. 10 years ago, life was very different for Pastor Dave. By his own admission, he was a troubled teenager who felt he had no purpose in life.
My parents went through a divorce and my family had some turmoil, and for the lack of a better word, I was a drug addict. I was confused at who I was, and I hadn't yet figured out the direction in which I wanted to go. It was a mix of confusion and anger at how my life had unfolded.
Only one thing mattered to Dave: his love of skateboarding.
It's kind of where all my friends were, and I really had a strong community in skateboarding, and really beginning to take my skateboarding seriously. I began to be noticed for my talent. And after high school, I moved back to Iceland. It was at that time that I also met Guðni, who was also a skateboarder and a very talented one. He was a couple years older than me, and I looked at Guðni almost as a role model. He was a leader in his community and had a passion and an energy for life that was really attractive, was really cool. And so we became really close friends very quickly.
In 2007, when Dave was 19, he moved back to Canada. That summer, his best friend from Iceland, Guðni, came to visit him. The two went on a road trip around British Columbia. They were young, free, and had the time of their lives. Guðni had a pilot's license, so one day the two friends decided to hire a commercial plane to see the valleys they'd been travelling through from the sky. With them on the flight were two of their friends, Leah and Elliot.
It was beautiful. It was sunny for the most part, but there were clouds in the sky as well. I had no fear of flying with Guðni. He'd always been a very professional pilot. And so we went into this valley and we're flying. And as we come around a bend in this valley, we noticed that there were some clouds up ahead. It's very dangerous. And so Guðni decides that we need to turn around. And so we turned the plane around and we came into this valley. And there was kind of an L type of a curve before entering the valley. And I have this moment which I recollect. There was this beautiful waterfall. I remember looking at this waterfall and having sort of an epiphany where I looked at this beautiful spot of creation and I was so thankful about my life. And this is for the first time in many years where a real sense of gratitude came over me.
But just a few seconds later, things started to go horribly wrong.
I look to my left and we see into this valley and we recognize that this valley that we're entering into is incredibly narrow. And not only that, but at the end of this valley, the mountains escalate very quickly. And so we come into this valley and for the very first time ever, I sense a real nervousness in Guðni. He says, this is not good. We're going to have to either try and get above the mountains or we're going to have to try and turn the plane around. He begins to try and turn the plane around. But in order to do that, he needs to slow the plane down a lot because this valley is narrow, and so the faster you go, the wider the turn. And so in order to make that tight turn, he needed to slow the plane down, and Guðni begins to slow the plane down. And we're about halfway through the turn, and to my horror, all of a sudden I hear this very, very loud noise, and it's the noise of the engine stalling. I hear Guðni say, we're going down. Some of my last memories is hearing the tips of the trees hitting the wings as we come closer to this mountain, and then we crash. Those moments before we crashed are some of the most difficult moments to talk about because I had thoughts that I'm not very proud of. I recognized that I had this deep sense of regret of how I'd lived my life. The last recollection I have is hearing the trees, and I think at that point, my body just tuned out. We crashed, and Elliot and Leah were actually conscious, and Elliot was able to open my door, and here he carries Leah about 100 feet away from the plane. And Elliot is one of my best friends. He was the best man at my wedding for many reasons, this being one of them, because he looked back, he's covered in gasoline, and he decides to come back. In his story, he tells me that he was yelling my name for about 10 minutes and shaking me, going over to Guðni and yelling Guðni and shaking him. And Elliot tells me that he actually just took his hand and he just slapped me across the face. And all of a sudden I came to.
Dave's first instinct was to check on his best friend Guðni.
I look to my left right away, and there's my friend. There's the guy who I looked up to, the guy who I cared for, and he was like a brother to me. He was very beat up, and probably the hardest moment of my life, watching my friend die. And the moment that I recognized that Gune had passed, adrenaline came forcibly into my veins, and I needed it out right away. And Elliot says, "Dave, look down at your leg, man." I just hadn't seen it, but the seat, when it dislodged, it came so far forward that it snapped my leg in half.
With Elliot's help, Dave eventually managed to get out of the plane. They sat on the ground next to the wreckage, waiting for a search and rescue team to arrive. Dave was in terrible pain. He was also in a state of shock.
I looked once back into the plane, which the windshield is shattered. There's blood everywhere. And I look at Gune, and I just think back to that moment. It's really sad what happened. He was a good man, and yeah, it was really difficult to leave him there. I kept saying to Elliot, "Do you think he's alive?" And Elliot says now that he knew he was dead, but he kept telling me, "Yeah, man, he'll be fine. He'll be fine." And but I knew. We were there for 6.5 hours. Actually, we were there looking at this plane with my friend who's passed in it. The moment that I heard the helicopters from a distance, it was like the beginning of a new life.
Dave was airlifted to hospital, where his long road to recovery began.
The moments following the plane crash were both very hopeful and yet very depressing and sad. I just lost my best friend, and yet at the same time, I had now a second chance at life. I had a second chance to correct the way I'd lived my life. I'd learned a great life lesson to not take my life for granted and not take any day for granted. And so the moments in the hospital were hard and yet hopeful at the same time. Hard, again, because I lost my friend and my body. I mean, the doctors were saying that I may walk with a limp. That was very hard news to hear. I think at the same time, I had such a motivation and ambition just to live life and live it to the full. And so though the doctors may tell me that I may walk with a limp, I said, "Give me the physio. I'm making this right." It was a few days after the crash, and I was watching some game show, and this nurse came in, and she was just checking in on me, and we began chatting, and I was surrounded by flowers and gifts from people who had brought those, and this nurse, she points at one of the flowers, and she says, "Do you know what kind of flower that is right there?" "It's a lily flower. It only grows in hardship." You see, this lily needs to be planted in the fall because the seed needs the cold winter to hibernate in order to come to fruition in the spring. Now, you may expect this seed to grow and blossom into a flower in the first season, but that's not the case. See, the first season, the seed only grows to about 1 inch or 2 inches, and then it dies. The lily actually dies, but yet its roots remain in the soil and they hibernate for another cold, hard winter, only then to receive life again in the spring and be given a second chance to blossom and to grow into a beautiful lily. But unfortunately, it doesn't. It dies again. And this cycle of life, expectancy, and death happens repeatedly until about the 5th, sometimes 6th or 7th season, the lily finally has gone through enough winter seasons to finally blossom a beautiful lily. I don't know who this nurse was, but she looked at me and she said, "Dave, I believe that you're going through a bit of a winter. And though you may not feel like seasons of winter you're growing, it's more of a time of death and hibernation, know that the way in which life works is that those seasons are seasons of growth." And every time I see a lily, I'm reminded that the hardships in our life can actually help us get perspective of life, help us grow, and give us a real thankfulness of this gift of life. And I recognize that the plane crash was one of those seasons. I can't really explain what happened within my soul, but I had changed. I definitely began to ask questions about my purpose. What am I here for? And I had some people in my life who had a real strong sense and faith in God. And so I decided to take some theological courses at a local college seminary. Man, it was really there that the Bible, the faith of Christianity, Jesus, they came to life in a way that they never had before.
It took almost a year for Dave to get back on his feet. After the accident, he thought he'd never be able to skate again, but since his recovery was going better than expected, he decided to get back on his skateboard.
I still remember the day where I went into my closet and there was my skateboard. It had been just about a year since I had touched that skateboard, and I picked that thing up and I put it down on the concrete in front of my house, and I just began rolling back and forth, and it honestly felt like breathing again. It felt like I had been underwater for a year and I was finally breathing. A couple weeks later, I was able to do an ollie, which is just a jump on a skateboard, and I remember, a month or two later doing my first kickflip when the board spins, and it was like life had come back into my veins. But also, I began to use skateboarding really as a bridge into sharing my story. Me and a friend named Jordan, we started something called Skate Life, where we would just hang out with a lot of young guys who were a lot like me before the plane crash. I was able to just hang out with them and through skateboarding share my life and share some of my change in perspectives of life. Today, my life is so different. I am a pastor. I'm a husband to my wife, Marisa. We get to celebrate 7 years this year. I'm a father of a 19-year-old special needs boy who we've had for 6 years now. And we have 2 biological children. We have Avalee, who's 3, and Jethro, who's 1. I feel like I'm living my dream. And that does not mean that I don't have my hard days. Of course I do. But I know that during the hard days, I'm reminded that those days never continue forever, that there's good days coming.
Pastor and skateboarder Dave Jonsson.